very grateful for all of you who are joining us, and as you continue to join us, and thank you also to our two participants today, our panelists. They come with very high recommendations, a lot of good experience, and I'm really happy to have them. We have with us Nneka Chiazor. She's with Cox Communications. She's a regional vice president, and she's responsible for Cox's regulatory work in the eastern part of the United States. But we also have with us Frans Vandendries. I'm sorry, I butchered that badly, Frans.
Not at all.
I'm an economist because I really do well with mathematics. Language is just hard for me. So my apologies for butchering names. He's vice president for legal and a lead consultant with Rockwater International Communications Advisors, Inc. in Canada. He's formerly with Cable and Wireless in the Caribbean. We're really excited to have both of you because this topic we're going to be talking about, broadband access, are things both of you have been up to your armpits in, or maybe even more deeply. So let me just start with that question, and that is, tell us about the work you've been doing and your experiences during this pandemic. Nneka, if you would lead us off, please.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to everyone who is viewing. Thanks for tuning in today. We definitely at Cox appreciate the opportunity to be here, especially at such a crucial time. We also appreciate the fact that we're able to do this over Zoom, right? This showcases the power of technology to unite versus divide and to connect. Well, we've been pretty up to our armpits, as you said, Mark, during this pandemic. Our focus and an area that we continue to lead in is bridging the digital divide, digital equity. And so with the onset of the pandemic, we realized that now more than ever, it's more important to get folks on the internet for distance learning, for healthcare, but with a focus on distance learning. And so we have a program called Connect to Compete, which is affordable internet that we made free at the onset of the pandemic for those who are signing on to the program, recognizing that, again, at times such as this where people are finding themselves in economic hardship that they've never experienced before, and with health concerns looming, it was more important to us to be able to demonstrate to the community that as a broadband provider, we recognize the importance of making that connection, especially for youngsters. And so we spent a lot of time and resources focused on that, Connect to Compete.
All right, thank you. Frans, what about you? What have you been doing and what have you seen?
Well, I've been working with clients across the Caribbean, in the South Pacific, and in Canada. Very broad, diverse set of circumstances, sometimes operators, sometimes regulators. The need for broadband is pretty much everywhere. The deployment and the quality of broadband is uneven, in all the countries that I've worked in. And yes, the pandemic has just highlighted the need that everybody needs to have adequate broadband. I'm seeing in the media all the time stories about, for example, Canadians who can no longer get their high school education because they live in rural areas without adequate broadband for the online services, or other education opportunities are not available, or even employment opportunities. More and more the government here is offering jobs that require or enable a certain amount of work from home, and if you don't have that broadband, you're excluded from those employment opportunities. And from what I've seen, all of the people I've worked with are all trying to work towards that goal of expanding networks, expanding services. They obviously have different environments they work in and different objectives and interests in what they're doing.
All right, so for both of you, and again, I'll start with Nneka, what do you think stands in the way in your experiences, what most stands in the way of getting the broadband available and getting people signed on?
Wow, that's a serious question, Mark. I mean, I would say there are a number of factors, right? So when we entered the pandemic in America, we, as the cable industry and Cox specifically, stood up to a pledge to keep Americans connected. Okay, and as part of keeping Americans connected, we did a number of things. We pledged not to disconnect phone service for customers at this time, to waive late fees, to support small businesses, and also, as I mentioned earlier, to offer Connect to Compete, our low-cost internet solution that was $9.95 a month. We committed to make that free for families who were joining. But there were several things that we found that got in the way of us as we tried to, start out initially with the pledge. One was information. How do those who are not connected to the internet, how do Americans in rural areas who, again, may suddenly have this need, how do they get the information that they need about these programs? Traditionally, all of us are accustomed to receiving information via email. Well, guess what? If you don't have internet access, how are you supposed to know that we have a program that's now available for free? If you're someone who's accustomed to getting your information on the news, on the radio, how are you supposed to get that information when you're in a stay-at-home condition because there's a statewide shutdown and you're not driving in your car to work anymore, right? So where do you go to get that information? We found access to information in what we now call non-traditional formats, which would be like radio, flyers, etc., was a challenge during the pandemic. But we were quickly able to overcome it based on our partnerships, leveraging our partnerships with folks in the community. Think about faith-based leaders. Think about the Boys and Girls Clubs. Think about those institutions where people go to for support and help. By leaning on them, we were able to get that out. But another challenge that we faced too was also, which I definitely have to applaud the US government for help stepping in to resolve this pretty quickly, was on the infrastructure side. So I want you to imagine that the entire United States, or at least a large portion of the population, was suddenly trying to access network infrastructure, which means from a capacity perspective, we have to scale our infrastructure as well. Not a problem for us, but it's a challenge though if the permitting offices, right, that are run by local governments are closed, if the permitting offices are not necessarily online. How do we navigate a work now, right, construction work now, permit later scenario when you're in a pandemic? So those were some of the early challenges that, again, we were able to overcome, working again with various local governments, state governments, and even the federal government at times to help us, again, navigate this unique situation. But I'm curious to hear what Frans has to say about, as they say in Canada, about how it was in Canada.
All right, that's a good segue. Frans?
Well, I imagine Canada has many of the similar challenges and opportunities and solutions that you would see in the United States. The need to build is still a major concern. And, if I can segue to some of the smaller markets where I've worked, where service can be uneven across the country, they have the additional challenge of the lockdown having locked down the country, not just the offices. So you have the challenge of bringing in material, which even if you bring in the material, how do you bring in the human resources you might need to plan, to design, to check what's on the ground, and then to install. So there continues to be a challenge in getting people onto the network simply from availability issues, but also a challenge in trying to address those issues, which you might not have had a few months ago.
So let me go back to you, Nneka, and I will get Frans's take on this as well. So you mentioned three types of barriers. You talked about at least three. One was getting the information out. And indeed, in our own research around here, we've discovered that different communities receive information differently. And so that is a big challenge. You talked about that, the permitting. And let me just zero on it for a minute. Permitting across the world is a barrier to people being able to do business. From your experiences, what kind of advice would you provide to other countries on how do you streamline the permitting businesses so that the people wanting to provide service can get it into the hands of the people that want it?
That's a great question. I think for those in other countries, I would recommend looking at the model that the Cyber Information Security Agency, CISA, has set up under the Department of Homeland Security, right? And in that context, we as an industry, we have blanket permits during natural disasters to gain access to fuel, to gain access to transportation, right? We have baked that into our business continuity planning and protocols. So we already know as an industry, if there's an incident or we anticipate an incident, CISA has already made provisions from a permitting perspective for there to be a blanket permit, a blanket waiver that allows us access to transport, access to fuel. It would be terrific, extremely beneficial and useful in other countries and in certain parts of the US too, if we were to adopt that same model when it comes to network infrastructure builds, right? Consider having a blanket permitting process that allows your local broadband providers or infrastructure providers to build their network and then work out the details of permitting later, right? So we're not suggesting that it shouldn't be done, because we recognize that for record purposes, there is, a need for permitting, but have that blanket permit available ahead of time so that, again, it does not get in the way of the agility of the provider to scale where need be.
Yeah, sounds like a good job for some blockchain entrepreneur, because that would tie all those pieces together and keep track of, hey, this did not complete it, but did not get completed, but we still got activity going on. It makes sure it got done.
Can I offer one more recommendation for those in other countries? To the extent you can ahead of time, also please consider digitizing your permitting process, right? So I understand that, there are some countries where statewide laws or countrywide laws might be challenging to get to, but digitizing that permitting process is also another fantastic way to go. I mean, in the United States, Fairfax County, for example, has a digital permitting process, which again, we found extremely useful, again, at the onset of this pandemic.
Great. Frans, what would you add to this streamlining of permitting?
Well, I would agree with Nneka that getting the information and the process online would be very helpful. Many of the governments in the countries I've worked in, they're just not there yet, unfortunately. The CISA recommendation is an interesting one, because that suggests to me we should be thinking about these things all the time. To me, that sounds like an approach of how do you build resilience into your networks, into your businesses, into your plans ahead of time, so that when some event like the pandemic arises, you're ready for it. That might be actually a quite useful approach to take in the Caribbean, where you never know when another storm comes and damages the country's infrastructure. How do you then react quickly to get the infrastructure back in place so that life can continue, as normal as you can in these circumstances?
Yeah, it's I agree. The idea I threw out of putting this all on blockchain actually came from a regulator in St. Lucia about 2 years ago. She saw licensing permitting as a big problem holding up expansion of infrastructure. And she said, look, government, we ought to just put this all on blockchain. Fell on deaf ears, but maybe they'll listen to her now. We'll see how that goes. The other thing you brought up, Nneka, that I was really intrigued by, and it's bothered me for a long time, is this problem that sometimes people don't see the value of broadband. Now, maybe the pandemic's taken care of that, and you can tell me if that is true. But there was those experiments done by the FCC here in the US a few years ago, where they found that people that were trying to get signed up for broadband, if you drop the price clear down to, in one instance, $2, people would still look at it and say, that just doesn't do anything for me. I'm not interested. Has a pandemic solved that? Are there things that come to your mind on how we can get that value raised up, or maybe sell that value better for people who aren't online?
You raise a really good point, Mark. There are those who, I mean, certainly in the past, who I think didn't have an opportunity to fully comprehend the value of broadband. I can share with you now, as we're making our way through COVID-19, a lot of folks in communities nationwide are seeing the value of broadband for sure. If you put on your TV, right, Zooms, it's like Zoom galore. And what is that? That is just, to me, just an application of a broadband infrastructure. Like, look at what we're doing today. Mm-hmm. So I would say that we've turned the corner in terms of, you know, is there a question regarding broadband's value proposition? The answer is absolutely. Where I see there being an opportunity for us as a globe actually to move forward is, how do we bring people along? So I had a really great conversation yesterday with folks in the aging community, like the Virginia Department of Aging, where they had mentioned they have stakeholders who have been in homes for 3 months. They've not left their homes. And I know, right? They're facing mental distress. I started to engage them on, well, do you know about telehealth? Do you know that we offer these particular services? And the response I got was, well, Nneka, you're assuming that everyone is familiar with Zoom, and you're assuming that everyone has a camera at home, and these are seniors who may have, you know, stopped their technology growth with Windows 95. And so I share that with you, Mark, to say that I think as part of, you know, bolstering our case on the value of broadband, we all have to figure out a way, how do we bring those who may not have been on board, not because they don't want to, but because they don't know how. And it goes back to that setting up an information infrastructure is what I call it. How do we do it? And how do we do it in multiple languages? That's another thing that we're uncovering as well, that there are some who may have said, oh, broadband is not for me, but now they're recognizing it is, but English might not be their first language. So I know, you know, I can talk a lot, Mark. I'm just going to keep quiet.
No, that's great, because we're here. You know, our basic purpose here is to allow people who are scattered around the world, still in some degrees of lockdown, share their experiences and try to learn from each other. In a pandemic, none of us have been down this path before. There is no such thing as a best practice. All we can do is figure out what we're going to try next. And so we just want people to learn from each other. So that's fine. Frans, what are your thoughts on this? You know, do we have the right value proposition as a pandemic, try to basically help with that? And then how do we communicate that value?
I think we've always had the value proposition. As Nneka says, not everyone was able to see it or to feel it. You know, my perspective is we tend to be creatures of habit. We do what we've done because that's what we've done. The pandemic has now forced many of us to change how we do things. I have certainly in the last few weeks done a whole lot more video conferencing than I've ever done before. The way I interact with my service providers has changed a lot. I no longer have a store to go to. I no longer have that kind of interaction with them. I still see, unfortunately, a challenge in how do you bring people along who, as you say, in the aging community, who never had this experience, this expertise, and how do you now train them when you can't be there physically with them to show them what to push on what device to get things activated? You know, I know in my own family, I have elderly parents. If I'm not there, how do I show to them how to use their iPad in order to do some kind of video conference with their grandchildren in another city? It's an almost insurmountable problem.
All right, well, thank you both very much for that. Now, one of the other things that we're witnessing around the world is a change in the paradigm's too strong of a word, but the basic way that the industry and government, the regulators, have interacted in the past. It used to be more of an adversarial type of relationship. Here we're seeing a lot of partnership, but I was wondering what your experiences are. Has the way you work with the governments, the regulatory community changed with the pandemic? If so, what's it like? Let's start with you again, Nneka.
All right. I feel like teacher's pet. Sorry. It's definitely from the time I started my career, and that was back in '97, a year after the Telecom Act was enacted, right? Back then, the relationship was definitely regulator, private sector versus public sector. I would say that was the atmosphere then. Fast forward to 2020 pandemic, I have not seen the kind of collaboration that I've seen in the past 3 months ever, and it has been terrific, right? We have state governments, local government, federal government reaching out to find out, okay, how are things going? What is happening? Not necessarily just with the network, but also with community partners, business partners. We have our government partners reaching out to us to find out what can we do to spur small business development at this time? What can we do to drive economic development at this time? So it's not just us as broadband providers, it's also us as an industry playing a huge role in economic recovery. I have some local governments that have already reached out to ask about smart cities, right? As they start to think about reopening or recovering or moving forward, they're telling me, hey, Nneka, we want to work with Cox on a newer normal, a better normal. And that type of collaboration and partnership, again, in my experience, and I believe it's brought on also because of the pandemic, not only is it unprecedented, it's a new way, I think a new approach that we should seriously consider. That said, I do think though that we still have to be mindful of the fact that, as I like to say to my team, regulators regulate. So let's not take for granted the partnership that we have. And let's also maximize resources, right? Both on the private sector side and the public sector side, where that complement each other, not compete with each other. I think that's going to be key too, as we look at economic recovery and growth in America going forward.
All right, thank you. Frans, what are your thoughts and experiences so far?
Well, I find that very encouraging that governments are reaching out, at least in the United States. The experience I've had, across several countries is extremely variable. And some of that is the companies may have a different set of interests. In a small community, everyone knows everyone else, and therefore there may be personality conflicts involved. And I can't say that I have seen on the whole an increase in cooperation. In fact, in one particular country I can think of, there's been an almost complete breakdown and a very strong adversarial relationship between the largest operator and the regulator. Driven by factors that are not necessarily COVID related, but it doesn't mean that because the pandemic arrived that there is now a common vision and a common goal and a healthy relationship between these entities. I would encourage operators and regulators to have more collaborative approaches to the issues facing the country. At the end of the day, we all have the same goal or a similar goal of expanding networks and services, and we need to find the best way of getting there, the most efficient way of using the resources we have to get there.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Frans. So we've now used up 20 minutes of my asking questions. I still have a lot of questions left, but I was wondering, people in the audience, if you'd enter some questions in the chat, I'd be glad to moderate that discussion. After about 20 more minutes, we'll have more of an open mic where people can talk with each other about what some of their experiences and thoughts are. But if you have questions for either of our panelists, please just enter them in the chat and I'll get them asked for you. So please put them there. But in the meantime, I still have some more questions for them. So I'm wondering, and I don't want to have a favorite or a pet in that case. I'm going to ask Frans this at first. Do you see the business model for broadband changing or being affected by the pandemic?
I think it's a bit early to say that the model is changing. We're only a couple months into the pandemic, and business models and plans and planning tends to be over a longer horizon than just a few months. I could see changes that the pandemic might drive. The need for more upstream bandwidth, for example, as more people are doing services or using services like this, where we're now forced into our residential communities where the networks may not necessarily have been designed for that kind of service. I could see if international travel does not pick up in the way it used to occur, that operators might see a reduction in roaming revenues, especially in the smaller countries where I've worked, where tourism is an important part of the economy. And there's another thing that I'm curious to see what will happen in the end. This is coming back to people being creatures of habit. When I lived in Cayman, it was my habit to always go into my provider's store and pay my bills there and see the people there. Clearly, I wouldn't be able to do that now. Everything, my interactions with the provider would be online, which, if that becomes the new normal for many more people, you might see less foot traffic into the stores, and providers might change their view on how many stores they need, how many partners, retail partners they need, and you might see a reduction in that. Again, it's a bit early to see whether people will change their habits that way, but that's something I'll be looking out for.
Okay, thank you, Frans. And Nneka?
Yeah, Frans, you raise a really good point about creatures of habit, right? So we are looking at that, right? We're looking at that both from the customer lens, the employee lens, and the government lens. I'll start with the government. So I think one of the reasons why, Frans, our experience in the US and yours is different is because we started out in the US with the Keeping Americans Connected pledge, right? And that is a pledge that Cox and other providers took. That's going to run through the end of July, I believe, right, to do certain things. We're hoping that there will be a continued understanding of the value of business, and business is in business to do what? Provide value in a way that makes sense. We'll see how that works with our regulatory partners once the pledge is over. Our hope and expectation is that there will be a respect and understanding that as a business, there are certain modifications and adjustments that we'll have to make. Some that we made as a result of the pandemic are, for example, our technicians. Our technicians at some point are not going into customers' homes right now, right? Safety for our employees, safety for the customer. We're sending our customers self-install kits, and it's gone really well. We have a virtual tool, again, another model adjustment that we use to help customers at home. These are new behaviors that seem to be taking well now. We have to see, though, what happens when we go back, right, to a normal state, air quotes. We have to see if there are new habits that we've become creatures of. And so we're going to be looking out for how that might adjust the way we do business as well. I can share with you that on the health front, one of the adjustments that we've made as a company that we're also offering to customers is telehealth. So as a company, our employees, in partnership with Aetna and Teladoc, gets telehealth services right now. And also we have a telehealth arm called Trapalo that is offering telehealth support to COVID-19 patients at this time, right? So that's one habit that has caught on like wildfire that's really successful. But again, we will see what happens when the country reopens.
All right, well, thank you. We have a question from Emmanuel. He's with the National Communications Authority of Ghana. And if you ever have a chance to go to Ghana and talk with these folks, I encourage you. I visited there a few years ago, and the way that the conversations we had changed how I thought about competition in this space. So they're very thoughtful and face some real challenges. So he offers a comment, but I'd like your thoughts on it. He said that the regulator in Ghana allowed some radio spectrum, provided additional radio spectrum for free to Vodafone and MTN, two of the major telecom companies there, so they could expand services. They were proactive in doing that. And I was just wondering, that's something we have seen in other countries as well, where the regulator's making special provisions for some additional, primarily radio spectrum, but maybe other resources too. What are you seeing in that space? And I think it may be particularly interesting to think about how do you ever take that back? If you do, how do you do that well? So let's start with Frans again.
Yeah, I've seen that happen in many countries. Temporary assignment for nominal or no charge of additional spectrum to help improve access, especially as different parts of the country see more traffic than they would have seen before. You're right. I think a challenge is going to be once everyone has gotten used to this extra spectrum, how do you take it back? There is one thing though that maybe this is a nice free trial and a try before you buy approach. I think it was in South Africa, the regulator announced that they would be taking their temporary assignment back in November ahead of a planned auction. Well, if the operators have gotten used to the extra spectrum, maybe they'll be willing to pay a little more for it or participate more vigorously in the auction for it. So there may be a silver lining to this approach of allowing the temporary use of spectrum.
Okay, thank you. And Nneka, what are your ideas?
In looking at Emmanuel's question, it reminds me of what Nebraska is doing at this time. So in Nebraska, they are offering, it's almost similar, but they're offering broadband service providers funds for supporting digital equity at this time, which I think is huge. And so the question has now become, well, if Nebraska is leveraging some of its funds to pay broadband service providers to serve low-income families, is this something that can endure post-pandemic, right? Very similar question. I think some of these models, again, we would have to see, right? What is the impact to the ratepayer or taxpayer? I don't know what Ghana's structure is like. What does it do to the value of spectrum long-term? This is something else I would say as an operator, they would definitely be interested in understanding those impacts before adopting it as firm policy.
All right, well, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions from David Cox. And Samantha, why don't we go ahead and just jump into letting people ask their questions directly or make their comments directly. Would you mind unmuting David and let him ask his question, please?
Sure, absolutely. Give me just one moment.
And Frans, he's picking on you.
I gathered, yes.
Yeah.
That was just a joke.
Thanks everyone.
Hope we've lost you, David.
Yeah, David, unfortunately, we can't hear you.
Networks spread, throughout a country to have 100% coverage.
Sorry, David, I didn't hear most of that.
What? Sorry about that. What do you think most operators need to understand?
Yeah, I think we're having some network capacity issues in St. Lucia, David. You might talk to your telecom provider about that, except that's you, so maybe that's a little tough. I think I can read the question from what he's written in the chat. So Frans, what David was saying is he says, do you think the operators what do you think operators the most need to understand about the regulator's desire for broadband networks spread throughout the country, particularly in these kind of small, geographically challenging markets where David's home in St. Lucia has a lot of those. So what are your thoughts on that?
The regulators are looking for services and networks to be expanded to all people, if possible, certainly as many people as possible. They're also looking for it to be done in the most cost-effective way for customers, and in most cases, competition is the way that happens. It's certainly the most efficient way for these services to be rolled out. If you have a proposal and if you can demonstrate or explain in the proposal how that serves all stakeholders in the market, that probably would go a long way to convincing the regulator or the government authority, whoever you're speaking to, that's might be the best way to go and that the proposal should be adopted. You know, all too often one receives comments and applications that are extremely self-serving and one-sided, and that doesn't help the regulator make decisions at the end of the day. It's useful to have a perspective from it. You are presenting your vision and what's best for your company, but to show how it works for all stakeholders, not just your own company.
Okay, Nneka, what do you think of that? Because what David's question, he has two parts to it. He's kind of asking, what do both sides need to know about each other? What do the operators need to know about regulators and regulators' perspectives, and vice versa? What do the regulators really need to understand about the operators and their situations? What are your thoughts on what they need to know and how can they learn it?
I think it's a really great question. I think on the operator side, what we need to know and understand is that the regulator, as I said earlier, I said it a little flip, regulators regulate, but in all sincerity, the regulator's interest remains, you know, the public's interest, right? Doing no harm to the public. And actually it's gone further, enhancing the public, so as we've seen in the pandemic. And at times, I think operators need to understand that regulators may not necessarily have all the perspectives from a technical standpoint that we have by being entrenched in the industry. I see this numerous times, and I catch myself doing it as well. When I speak to a policymaker, I can rattle off, okay, this is 10G and this is what it does, and I had the senator tell me 10G, I have no G, right? So just being mindful of the fact that the regulators that we engage with may not be as conversant with the innovations we're coming out with as we are. On the regulator side, I would say something to consider about operators is we have an incentive to not only do no harm to the public or malign the customer, especially if you're a bona fide company, but we have every incentive to wow our customers, to wow the public. And so policies that are put in place that might deter investment, ultimately, right, restrain the benefits that could accrue to the public. And it's not just a talking point, it's actually fact. If we look at a business case and we see, for example, that the government is gonna make investment in an area where we would have made investment, why would you do that? This is the way an operator thinks. And so getting to that place of shared stewardship is, in my view, again, more critical now more than ever as we move forward through this economic recession that we find ourselves in the United States. And again, for countries, for those who are tuning in from other countries, I encourage you to think about that as well. One last point, and I promise you I'll keep quiet, on something regulators should consider about operators. In the telecommunications space, we're all operators. We're all cooperators, right? We compete and we cooperate, and we're competitors as well. And so policies that ensure a level playing field, I believe are, as Cox does, are the best policies. Consider the fact that you might be promoting a policy regarding 5G that might not necessarily be beneficial or useful to a company or a sector of a section of the sector that's focused on fixed wireline services or cable services. So something I think, again, regulators can consider.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think implicit in both of your comments is a realization probably a lot of people are having, and that is that the time to develop the right relationship with the government or the regulator was 5 or 10 years ago. It's too late now. So the time to prepare for that relationship for the next emergency is now. It just takes time to be able to do that. Oh, go ahead, Frans.
It's never too late to work on that relationship.
Okay.
But the time to be ready for now was 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah, very good point. A professor, friend of mine here, talks about the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. the next best time is right now. And so it's exactly on that point. Crystal has a comment. Sam, can we let Crystal have the mic, please?
So Dr. J, a lot of people don't necessarily want to have audio or video right now. So if we could just go ahead and ask, I believe Crystal sent one, and then following that, we have another question from David Cox.
All right. So Crystal, are you willing to speak, or if not, that's okay.
Yeah, no, she's not. If you could just ask her question. Yeah.
See, Sam is the polite one here. I'm just the professor. I just do rude things.
No.
My apologies, Crystal. So her question is, she talks about the Universal Service Fund, which in the United States is a specific fund for expansion of networks primarily, and to subsidize the prices. That's the basic intent. Call it different things around the world, but it's a common framework that's just done very differently from where you might be, from wherever you might be. So she's wondering, is this something that could be used to assist in reducing this asset access gap right now? So Frans, what about that? Are these kinds of government funds for expanding networks, et cetera, are these a good option for expanding access and subscription now?
I think it is an option that is available. If the funds are there, I think they should be used. I think these funds have broader challenges and concerns. You know, and these are the usual ones that have existed for a long time now. Is it transparent? Are there clear rules around how funds are to be dispersed and projects to be selected? Are you collecting too much money and holding it in the fund? Are you not collecting enough money? Those are all questions that are not, or issues that are not related to expanding access. But if the funds are sitting there and there are worthy projects that are necessary or that are needed in order to reduce the gap in access to broadband, then yes, they should be used.
Okay. Nneka, any thoughts from your part?
I agree with Frans. If there are, worthy endeavors out there that the funds can be applied towards, absolutely they should be used for that.
All right. So David Cox has another question. I'll ask it. Sam, before I do that, could you instruct people on how they can raise their hand if they are willing to speak, and then I won't rudely call them out?
Absolutely. Yes. So we would love to hear from any of our participants regarding any additional questions or experiences that you're currently having right now. And so in order to do so, if you are on a laptop or a desktop, you would go to the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You would select the participant tab, and then there's the hand icon that you can click on, and then that will prompt me that your hand is raised. And then I will unmute your audio, and you are free to share your video if you'd like. If you're using a phone or a tablet, that toolbar will be at the top of your screen, and same process. Click the participant tab and then the hand icon. That will prompt me that you'd like to ask a question or share an experience. I'll also go ahead and send those instructions in the chat, so it'll be step by step, so you can reference there as well. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you, Sam. So folks, raise your hand if you're willing to verbalize your thoughts, questions, share your opinion, your experiences. Please be ready to do that. In the meantime, while you're doing that, I'll go to this next question. And David targets you in this case, Nneka. He says, do you think that the pandemic has put increased pressure on operators to focus on end-to-end broadband solutions, including like Wi-Fi in the home? In so many cases, complaints about service frequently boil down to the Wi-Fi in the house isn't being set up very well, as opposed to the real connectivity problem. And do you think operators can manage this going forward? So what are your experiences? What are your thoughts on that, Nneka?
I have a lot of thoughts. I'll start with this. I'm going to help you out, Mark. David Cox, since you asked me the question, would you mind putting on your video so I can see you? Or if there are any Cox customers on the Zoom session, would you mind putting on your video so I can see you? Or any Cox employees on the session, if you don't mind putting on your video. There we go. Okay, now we're talking. Oh, David can't. All right.
David, yeah.
You know, I would say that the pandemic, I wouldn't say it put increased pressure on operators. If anything, I think it unleashed our innovation, right? So as everyone knows, right, we have been in our industry doing this race for the home. What are we going to do to own the home? We recognize that we compete with the Googles, Facebooks, Amazons of this world. We recognize too that we do have the privilege of having access to people's homes by virtue of the fact that if you're in the cable industry, you have field technicians, right? So for us with this pandemic, we viewed this as, wow, this is an opportunity for us to, again, unleash these innovative solutions that we've had, you know, bubbling or swirling in our psyche, right? See how they work, see how the customers, the public reacts to it, and then see what we can do to innovate further from there. So I wouldn't say it's pressure, I would say it's really an opportunity. An example of an end-to-end solution, I'll bring it up again. Telehealth, right? So we are looking now intently at the home as a hospital, right? Looking at how do you provide full-on healthcare services leveraging technology in the home, sending weight scales to people's home, diabetes tests to people's home, labs to go. There is such a thing, going to people's homes and being part of that health equity solution. So regarding the other question about, you know, the challenges that customers face, right? So we know too, right? And we have experience with the fact that we are at the transport layer, the infrastructure layer, and our customers see us first. So what does that mean? If you have a problem with your Google website, what comes to mind is not that Google has a problem. What comes to mind is, oh, maybe I have a problem with my internet connection, which is the broadband provider. And we are equipped to handle that. I think what you'll find though going forward, as we're in these virtual spaces, is going to become very clear and very apparent what aspects of that technology ecosystem is creating a problem. There's several tools that are out there now that let folks know, you know, this is really a problem with this particular app, or this particular app is hogging up bandwidth. People are becoming more familiar with those sorts of issue resolution, root causes. And so I don't see that as a problem for us going forward. Again, I think it's going to be one of those areas where people will see that the broadband service that they have is really good, and that we do a really good job in trying to keep Americans connected.
I would echo that, but I would just suggest, you know, there still is the question that Nneka, you mentioned before, of how do you get that information out to people? You know, I've been in this industry for a while. I have a sense of the Wi-Fi versus the broadband versus the wider internet versus the application provider on the far end. And so if something goes wrong, I have a sense of, well, how do I start troubleshooting and figuring out what went wrong? I think David's concern is the average consumer just says, I can't get to whatever I wanted, phones up the broadband provider, and there's nothing wrong from the broadband provider out to the internet. So it might be the Wi-Fi, but trying to explain that to customers who just see access, whether it's mobile, wireless, wireline, it's more and more just access, and that's what they see. And the first person, as Nneka says, the first person they see is their broadband provider, and that's who they call.
Great. Okay, thank you. Sam, you have someone with their hand up.
We do. So Emmanuel, it looks like your hand is raised, so I'm going to go ahead and ask to unmute you, and then let me know once you can hear us.
Yes, thank you once again. And I would want to appreciate PURC for this awesome job you're doing. We're learning so much by sitting in our office. This year we are not traveling to PURC for the in-service training. Yeah, but you are giving us a dose of knowledge by bringing a lot of expertise to our doorstep. So in Ghana, as I said earlier, we give this temporary spectrum for them to use for 3 months to be able to enhance their connectivity and provide service to service providers. Then we went further ahead to do what we call the KYC, know your customer, where we give license, the licensees are operating. We don't really know much about them, what they are doing and how they are doing. Occasionally we monitor, we sanction, we engage them. But this time we decide to organize a session just like we are doing. We give them a template. They populate the template in a presentation. They send to us. We gather at the authority head office with the CEO leading the team. And then at the other side, the service providers also will come together and take us through the presentation. We tend to ask them questions about their operations, share with us the challenges, and you could see that they are so excited that they've gotten the opportunity to interact with the regulator, not about punishment or sanctions or other things, but to freely engage the regulator. And the regulator is also learning at first hand some of the operations that the service providers are going through, including their challenges and what we can do to facilitate their operations. Mind you, if they succeed, we succeed. If they die, we die together. So through this, we've been able to learn so much, and we intend making this engagement routine, part of our regulatory processes, engage them periodically to understand the market. And so I think that through this engagement and the lessons we learn from platforms like this, we are also able to learn from best practice from other countries. And when we meet and we are having a discussion, we are able to chip in some of those lessons. For instance, one area we're looking at is subsea or the submarine. We'll realize sometimes we have challenges with the cost of internet in Ghana here. And the concern seems to be that the submarine operators seems to be charging fees that are higher. So that inbuilt cost makes it expensive for them to deliver the broadband services. So now we want to zoom in better to understand the operations of the submarine. So these are foreign entities that are not from Ghana. They are just terminating at our shops. And we believe that once we are able to dive deeper into their operations, and for instance, how are they serving the same clients in other countries, which they are having them, and why are they serving different clients with different prices in Ghana? Once we're able to, for instance, understand some of these nuances, we should be able to streamline access and cost for broadband. So on the whole, it's been a learning curve for us, and we can say that the pandemic has also been beneficial because we've gotten closer to our service providers. So once again, Mark and your team, you are doing a good job, and then keep it up.
Well, thank you, Emmanuel. Say hi to all of our friends in Ghana.
Okay,
you guys, you've got a lot going on there. Thank you so much. Sam, anybody, or any reactions from Frans or Nneka?
I'm very happy to hear that kind of interaction. When I was working for an operator, in-house in the operator, you know, quite often, until we got to a certain stage, quite often the interaction we had was when something was going wrong. You know, you only go to the doctor when something's wrong. So your only experience of the doctor is when something's wrong. Well, similarly, when the regulator came calling, something was wrong. So it helped a lot to have regular meetings where you just discussed what you were doing, what your plans were. And I wouldn't say that the relationship was completely, the relationship wasn't completely easy, because you were always wondering, well, was there something that they had a concern about, and could something come up during the meeting? But it was very helpful to have those regular meetings that were not premised on an issue that had to be addressed.
All right, very good. Well, thank you. For Crystal, Charlie Lewis has an answer for you. I hope you be sure to take note of that. Charlie's one of our telecommunications sages from South Africa. Had a great time working with him many years ago, developing university curriculum on telecommunications policy. Charlie knows what he's talking about. He's a good guy. Sam's, anybody else have their hands up?
We don't have any hands raised right now, no.
Okay, well, I have one more question. We have just a few minutes left. And both of you have alluded to this a little bit, but I just want to zero in on it. And just so that I'm not playing favorites, I'll start with.
I'll take it. I want to be your favorite. I want to take that.
So we're learning lessons here. We're trying some things that we've not tried before and wouldn't have tried before had it not been for the pandemic. Frans, what of these things do you think we're going to keep going forward?
That's going to be, that is a really interesting question, because a lot depends on how the consumer changes or doesn't change going forward. How the market as a whole changes going forward or not. You know, I'd like to think that the increased cooperation between government regulator and operator, and the increased flexibility and responsiveness to the needs of the different stakeholders in order to improve service, I'd like to think that that would continue. You know, will we, it's still perhaps a bit early to say whether we will fall back into old habits of an adversarial relationship, or whether we'll move forward into a more cooperative, a more flexible relationship.
Okay, thank you. And Nneka, what about you? What are your thoughts? What do we keep?
Well, as your pet, Mark, I would say one of the things I see us keeping for sure is hand sanitizer. I don't see that practice going away anytime soon. I don't. I've been speaking with folks about the office of the future, workforce of the future. And I see sessions like this, I see us keeping it as a society, because it allows us to collaborate across geographical boundaries, right? This could easily be a UN chat. We have Ghana represented. We have so many countries represented. I see us keeping that. From a regulator operator perspective, I see us keeping that public-private partnership model going forward. I think the strength of it is going to lie on the approach on the regulator side, and the upholding of the commitments on the operator side. So to the extent we have more folks like Emmanuel who are doing outreach without it being bad news, right? Just trying to understand the market conditions. And you have companies like Cox and others that are similarly situated, upholding their commitments and doing what's best for their customers. I think you'll see that shared success model continue.
Okay, well, Frans and Nneka, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise here and your experiences. And thank you to all the audience for being with us. As Emmanuel said, we're used at PERC to meeting people in their countries or them coming to us and getting a lot of good direct interaction. Can't do that right now. So we're learning how to be as helpful as we can through this type of technology, this type of approach.